Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. Nobody in my agency or any other agency of the federal government has reviewed or approved what I'm about to say. The main reason is even I don't know what I'm about to say. Today I'm going to talk about a number of things, but I'm going to warn everybody, and you may watch this in a week, you may watch this in 2 weeks. I'm not going to be here for a couple weeks. I'm going to play the same tape probably over and over again. So what I'm going to talk about are things that are pretty general, and also some things that are pretty specific to right now. Usually I talk about what happened this week, and I've found that if I replay it, people are pretty unimpressed because the news is old. So I've had shows where I've played old tapes, and all of a sudden I'm talking about the bombing in Kosovo or the impeachment hearing or something like that. So that's the way it's been up to now. What's the situation right now? The situation right now is the news is boring. Probably so is this show. Where the war in Kosovo is over, even though apparently some people are still taking pot shots at our troops out there in Kosovo. NATO has occupied the entire province of Kosovo. The Serbs have moved out. The Kosovars, the Albanians, are moving in. They're shooting some Serbs, according to the Serbian Orthodox Church. They're raping some of the Serbian women, doing some of the same things that were done to them. Terrible thing. What can we do? Some of the NATO regions are more active in trying to stop that. The Americans are, the Germans are. Some are just sitting back and watching the carnage, like the French and the Italians, or at least that's what they're being accused of. Excuse me. Is it going to be a big story? Probably not, unless we take some casualties, and we probably will. Why? Because we're clearing out minefields, we're disposing of unexploded ordnance like cluster bomblets and things like that. And some people are taking pot shots at us, Serbs in some cases, Kosovars, Albanians in others. We're in the process of disarming the KLA. The heavy weapons of the KLA have already been turned in. Some of the AK-47s and personal weapons are been turned in. 90 days after the agreement was reached a week or two ago, the KLA is going to be completely disarmed, or so we would like to think, except for the AK-47s in the basement. However, they won't be allowed to go around with their uniforms on. So you're not going to have this all inclusive story that goes on every day that everybody's concerned with, to the exclusion of everything else, like we had when we had an actual war going on and possibly a ground war threatening in Kosovo. So that's almost over. The impeachment was a story that went on every single day that people were absolutely concerned with. Were we going to keep our president? Was our president going to be overthrown? Was he going to get convicted? Was he going to get away with murder? Some people thought that he would get away with murder. Other people thought that it was completely unjustified, what was being done, or that the charges didn't merit impeachment. He got off. It's over. We hardly hear anything about it. And now we're kind of between. The election period really hasn't started yet. And it looks like even if it did, Bush is way ahead in the Republican Party, and Gore is way ahead in the Democratic Party. Will things turn around? Will excitement happen? Will there be turnarounds? Will front runners all of a sudden collapse like they did in 1996? It's hard to say, but it could happen. But it's not going to happen in the next couple weeks. So we're in that doldrum. What are we concerned about? What is so important? What's going to be the big story? It's hard to say. So I'm going to talk about something that isn't a big story, and that is the possibility that the national debt may actually be paid off in the next 15 years. And what does that mean for America? What does that mean for the economy? Is it a good thing? Is it not a good thing? Well, how can anybody imagine that paying off the national debt would be a bad thing? First of all, what is the national debt? National debt is the accumulated debt that the national government owes. Who does that owe that debt to? Owes it to the American people, owes it to the Social Security Trust Fund, owes it to the Medicare Trust Fund, but most of all, it owes it to investors in Treasury bonds. Why does anybody care about that? Well, you should care about that a lot, because Treasury bonds are the hardcore, most dependable investment that anybody can make. And the proof of that is that billions and billions of dollars in Treasury bonds are being invested by foreigners who are moving their capital out of their own country and into the United States to buy treasuries. What are the interest rates? The interest rates are very low. They're long-term, 30-year bonds for the most part, although they do have other lanes. And basically, they only get some 5.75%, 6% interest. How do we know what the interest is? It's set by the Federal Reserve and by the market. And those are rates that are posted. You can pick them up, open up your Wall Street Journal or your business page, and there they are. What do they represent? They represent all the borrowing, all the money that's been borrowed by the federal government since the time of George Washington. And basically, it's built up to a national debt of $5.6 trillion. Now, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, that national debt was going up $200, $300 billion a year. At the worst year, the national debt increased $290 billion in 1 year. The yearly increase was called the deficit. The net total debt is the national debt. Right now, presently, $5.6 trillion, down a little bit from its top. And a lot of that is because the deficit has been turned around and turned into a surplus. And right now, they're projecting that the surplus is going to grow and grow and grow. The Republicans want to take that surplus, hand it back to the people in tax cuts. The Democrats want to spend it on Social Security, Medicare, social programs. Some of the other interest groups want to spend it on the military, build up our military, which apparently has been run down and shortchanged over the last decade or so. That was the peace dividend. Is the fact that we've gone from deficit to surplus a peace dividend? It's hard to say. It's hard to say where it really came about. One of the big things that's driven down that deficit is the very, very high payroll tax that we have. What's the payroll tax? Well, just take a look at your paycheck and you'll see. You look at your paycheck and you'll find 7.5% taken off the top if you make less than about $65,000 a year. That's your share of the payroll tax. It's also called FICA. Your employer also pays 7.5%. So that comes to a total of 15%, although it's really about 12.6 because the remainder goes to Medicare. It's really a Medicare tax, even though it's one big tax. The fact of the matter is that that tax was increased in the early 90s and late 80s in a couple different steps, and it was increased because Social Security was going broke, and they thought it would go broke at the beginning of the 90s. Now it's probably not going to go broke until 2029, and if they adjust the Social Security and throw the surplus towards Social Security, it won't go broke until 2053 or maybe never, because the baby boomers will all retire and overload the Social Security system unless things keep on growing. Well, what's the basis of this whole idea that by 2015 the national debt could be paid off? The basis of it is an assumption that may or may not be true. And that assumption is that the American economy will grow 2.1 to 2.6% every single year for the next 16 years. Has that ever happened in the past? Well, on the average, yes, it has. During the 50s and 60s, of course, America was the only surviving great economic power after World War II destroyed Europe and Japan. Uh, we did have growth rates in that area. During the 90s, we've had even greater growth rates than that. Sometimes 3.2%, some quarters up to 4%. What does that mean? That means that this boom has to keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going and never stop. And then all of a sudden our debt is paid off. Now, what happens when we pay off the debt? Well, a lot of very, very good things. One thing is that out of our budget, which is a little less than $2 trillion a year, and our GNP, how much everybody makes and produces in our country, is over $8 trillion a year. Basically, what we produce out of that is quite minimal. So out of this $2 trillion a year, about 200 billion, maybe a little less, just goes to interest on the national debt. And so who is that interest being paid to? Well, a lot of it's being paid to foreign millionaires, dictators, and people that invest in treasury bonds. A lot of it is being paid to individuals, Americans, and some of it is being paid back to the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund, where all the surpluses in those trust funds are invested in treasury bonds. So basically they borrow back, they buy back the treasury bonds that finance the national debt in the first place. And in fact, even though the entire national debt's $5.6 trillion, the amount that's actually not already owned by the government itself is only $3.6 trillion. So $2 trillion is already surplus in these various Medicare trust funds, Social Security trust fund, all these different trust funds. And basically it's money paid back to the government in a different form, and the interest is being paid back to the government. But it's still a net out to people, not in the government, of about $150 to $200 billion a year. That'll disappear once the national debt is paid off, because who are you going to pay the interest to if you're not paying it off, if you don't have a debt? If I don't owe any money, I don't have to pay any interest. And so those treasury bonds disappear, and so does the interest payments. Now, the other thing that happens is the government doesn't borrow money. The government has this big load of debt, $5.6 trillion. That money could be available to businesses, to real estate, to the American people, to consumer borrowing, all the other places that debt could be financed. So when this debt goes away, the interest rates goes down. Now, on the other hand, it could be bad for America because, oddly enough, the interest rate and the national debt, in other words, those treasury bonds, are actually the basis for America having the most powerful currency in the entire earth. Right now, people invest in treasury bonds. They know that America is good for it. They know the American taxpayer will pay back the interest every single year. And consequently, they put their money in dollars. And those dollars, the dollar, is the reserve currency for the entire world. Now, Europe is uniting and creating one single currency. As a matter of fact, partially because of the Kosovo War, partially because of uncertainty, that new currency, that new potential reserve currency, the euro, that the mark from Germany, the franc from France, the peseta from Spain, all these different currencies have united and become the euro underneath the control of the European Central Bank. There's a very, very strong possibility that the euro could become the next reserve currency. Why? Because if we don't have any national debt, we don't have those very, very trustworthy treasury bonds for people to put into dollars. If they don't need to put it into dollars, and if they do want to invest in dollars, they got to invest in stocks or corporate bonds or something else, which is more risky than government bonds. Why should they invest in dollars? Maybe they'll invest in the euro. The Japanese yen, which is the other reserve currency, at least in the 90s and the 80s, the Japanese have built a national debt of $3.5 trillion. And oddly enough, the amount of our national debt that's not owed back to our own government, that's actually owed to outsiders, is almost the same as the national debt of Japan. Japan gets their act together, they would have a lot of treasuries to be able to sell so that people would buy yen if they didn't trust their own currency. And they were trying to get their money out of their own third world or countries, dictatorships, whatever. So it's possible that the yen could become a reserve currency. The other possibility for a reserve currency is the Chinese yuan. And the Chinese yuan, the Chinese are building up their economy so quickly. They're growing at 8 to 10% a year that within 15, 20 years, they could have an economy the same size as the United States. And with tremendous amounts of extra money, a tremendous market coming in, and the way the Japanese are as mercantilist as they seem to be, in other words, they want to buy less than they sell outside, there could be a tremendous possibility of the Chinese yuan to be the next reserve currency, especially if America doesn't have a national debt and treasury bonds to sell to outsiders. So America could be the most wealthy country, could have the lowest interest rates, and ironically lose its position of having the reserve currency. Now, what else would happen if America lost its primacy in the world by being the reserve currency of the world? Now, one thing about being the reserve currency, one of the best things about it, is that the price of oil is in dollars, the price of gold is in dollars, the price of all commodities are in dollars, so that we can just buy at the market price without having to shift our currency into some other currency, all of the commodities of the world. And they're basically posted in dollars. So we have a very, very good feel for what the value of the dollar is. Can somebody run the dollar? Yeah, it's possible that somebody could run the dollar, but it would be very, very difficult. Because if they did run the dollar and they forced the dollar to increase in price, or they forced the dollar to devalue and to go down in relationship to everything else, the price of all of the commodities in the world would go up, and there'd be inflation throughout the world. So American currency, because it's that reserve currency, doesn't have that vulnerability that the Asian currencies, for instance, had during the Asian economic crisis a year or two ago. Basically, international currency dealers were first running the currency of Indonesia, running it down, forcing it to reduce its value by 35, 40, 45, 50%. And did that make oil more expensive? No, not in terms of the reserve currency of the world in dollars. Or did that hurt the world market in cotton or gold? No, it didn't hurt at all. So they were able to run these currencies, which have relatively small economies, and really hurt the reserves of these countries. Some of the countries just let their currency float and collapse and let their people's savings disappear and have a real problem, a real economic problem that way. Other countries tried to protect their currency by using up their reserves in order to protect the value of the currency. That's what happened in South Korea. In South Korea, the situation was so bad that the Koreans were within $2 billion, just a couple days, of having no reserve currencies at all, in which case they could neither buy nor sell anything from outside of their country, period. And they were a country that was dependent on food imports from outside. Could have caused a total economic collapse of South Korea, and possibly even a famine, because there was a famine going on in North Korea at the same time. They would be unable to make a transaction throughout the world. And that was came an inch from happening to the 13th largest economy in the world just a year and a half ago. That's what that Asian crisis was all about. Could that happen here in America? No, not as long as we're the reserve currency. But if we're not the reserve currency, somebody who could run a portion of run up the price or run down the price of the dollar in international trade, and it doesn't take buying or selling that big a proportion of the world of that nation's currency to be able to do that, because all it has to do is cause the price to go up in trading on a specific day. Can that be done now? It can be done. The dollar goes up, a hundredth of a Pfennig, which is a German penny, or a hundredth of a pence, which is a British pound. Every day or so goes up a little bit, goes down a little bit, no more than 1% or 2%. And the main reason is because the dollar is the basis for all the other currencies, because it is the reserve currency. And if we don't continue to be the reserve currency, because we don't have this very, very secure government treasury bonds out there, because we have no national debt at all, it could be a problem. A foreign currency dealer could actually make a run on the dollar the way they made a run on the Hong Kong currency, or a run on the South Korean currency, one after another. Between 1994 and 1998, one currency after another was going down to these big currency attacks. And it was really affecting the economy of each of those countries. A run on the dollar, if it's not a reserve currency, could really affect the inflation within the United States, the interest rates within the United States, and really put us at a greater risk of being under the thumb of foreign economic powers than we are now as the reserve currency. And a lot of people think that while we had this incredible debt, that the Japanese were buying up tens and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of American debt, that they could affect our economy and our interest rates by suddenly selling all of their treasury bonds. In a few years, that might be a moot point if there's no treasury bonds to buy or to sell, because we'll be buying back foreign treasury bonds as we pay off this debt. And in fact, the national debt has gone down, but even more so, more and more of the national debt has been bought by the Social Security Trust Fund or the Medicare Trust Fund as they've gone up against the total amount of debt. Now that sounds like, well, I mean, who cares about that? But the possibility that America, while doing something that's unprecedentedly good for our economy and throughout history, I don't think that we've had a national debt surplus, or a national surplus. I don't even know what we call it. I don't think that that's happened since the 1800s. There may have been an instance in the 1910s when that might have happened, but I'm not absolutely sure about that. However, it could have this odd downside and this odd impact in that we wouldn't be, or we might not be, the basic currency of the entire earth that we've been since the end of World War II, that reserve currency. Now, once before, basically what we're talking about has happened. During the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s, up until World War II, the reserve currency was the old British pound. The British Empire covered 1/4 of the earth, and probably 25–30% of the entire Earth's economy was contained within the British Empire. They had India, they had Pakistan, they had part of China, they had England, they had most of the financial resources. Well, after World War II, they lost their position as the reserve currency. And what happened? There was one devaluation after another, sudden spurts of inflation, large amounts of unemployment in England. The English, of course, lost their empire, but they lost their primacy as well. And they're still unwilling to go in and become part of the euro because they have such a connection to the pound, which is their currency, that was once the dominant currency of the entire earth. And of course, it is possible, history is that way, that the dollar could no longer be the dominant currency of the earth, just the way the pound is no longer the dominant currency of the earth today. My name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. thank you very, very much for watching my show, and I'll see you the next time I do it.